A balanced wargame is a better wargame. And in this video, I'm going to tell you why. And the main reason that designers must balance their games is because it promotes the health of the game that they're designing. And I started thinking about this topic because I got a few comments on one of my recent videos saying that balance was unnecessary, and specifically because war in reality is not balanced. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why that doesn't necessarily apply to war games and why this is maybe a misapprehension of the real nature of war and conflict in the first place. So before we do anything, we should talk about where I am. Actually, I'm still on vacation, as you can see. I'm getting a little scruffy, so I hope you can forgive that. But I am here in France, and I just thought I'd make a video, so I hope you guys enjoy it. So what is balance? And to me, a balanced game means that there are conditions laid out by the game designer that establish an environment where player skill contributes and ultimately determines victory. And by player skill, I mean the ability to make meaningful and effective decisions towards the accomplishment of the objective that brings victory to that player. So with that said, how do we balance games? Like, maybe that's the second thing that really we need to talk about. Like, how do we accomplish this? And I think there's two basic ways that you can do it in broad terms. And the first, and I think most common, is the balance by force, by points, essentially, where different units have a point value based on what the designers judge their significance, their effectiveness in the game to be. And then players use those points values to construct an army to play against each other with. And the second method that I see is by scenario or victory condition. And this is where the players or the game designer sets up a scenario with an imbalanced force in mind and manipulates the victory conditions or the terrain in order to adjust for that balance to make sure that both players have a reasonable chance of winning the game. So let's talk first about the method of balancing by force or by points. And I think this is most common because it is objective. It's Games Workshop, for instance, telling everybody that this unit is valued at 50 points, and everybody accepts that as a standard, and you build your armies based off of those points values. It's very simple. It's easy because everybody sort of agrees upon it by de facto to obey Games Workshop, essentially, and to trust their judgment. Now, of course, we know that that judgment is not always accurate or correct, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's the premise, right? Is you balance the game by assigning points, and you allow everybody to have a common frame of reference, and we're trusting essentially the game designers. Now, of course, you can always, it's your own game, you can always adjust from there, but it provides a common frame of reference, and I think that's the most common thing that we see today, because it is pretty simple to do for players, right? It doesn't involve a lot of intuitive judgments. It's just we accept that this unit is this point value, and we go from there. We build our army based on that. The scenario or victory condition method of balancing is a lot more complex because it requires a lot more of an intuitive judgment. So this is something that Advanced Squad Leader does. I think they do have a points value, but I don't think anybody plays with them. but they might be used by the game designers. But if you look at the scenarios that Advanced Squad Leader creates, it's pretty clear that they are designed with an imbalanced force in mind, often because they are based on real life scenarios that took place in World War II. And these scenarios, as you know, these commenters pointed out, are not necessarily equal in number or in force, but the Advanced Squad Leader scenario designers clearly they take it in mind that because people play tournaments of Advanced Squad Leader, right? So they bear in mind the imbalance in forces, and they provide balancing options in the scenario card, so you can add forces to one side or the other, or sometimes it adjusts the victory conditions as well. But even from the very baseline of the victory conditions and the scenario, you can see, if you look carefully, that they've been designed to provide the weaker force with an advantage, whether it's in terms of position or the victory condition, um, in order to give them a chance to win. Okay, so, but again, that's more from the scenario designer, right? So that is not necessarily coming from the players, although they do give the opportunity to adjust the balance of a scenario to the players by providing recommendations based on, you know, player skill or just how you find the scenario to perform if you play it multiple times. So that's how we balance a game. Why should they be balanced? And so again, let's talk about our counter argument here is that real wars and real battles are not balanced, and therefore war games do not need to be balanced. Okay, so why do war games need to be balanced? Well, first of all, because everybody wants to have fun when you play a war game, right? And let's illustrate this just as an example. I am, I would say, a competent but unexceptional player of Legions Imperialis. I would be willing to bet a fair amount of money that if you and I played a game of Legions Imperialis and I had a 1,000 or 2,000 point advantage, I'm going to win the game. I don't really care what mission we play. Um, I don't care what army you take. If you have 1,000 points and I have 3,000 points, I'm going to win the game. Um, I'm happy to take anybody up on that challenge if they want to come out to where I live or meet me at a convention, and we can try it. Um, but I would be willing to lay some money on that. Okay, and so imagine that we did that not just once, but twice, 3 times, 10 times. You're not going to enjoy playing Legions Imperialis anymore. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to want to play me. You're not going to want to play under those conditions. Okay, so on the face of it, I think this argument is just kind of silly because we play war games to have fun, and and the fun comes from meaningful decisions that we make. And if you are outclassed in every way, um, you're not going to be able to make meaningful decisions. It's not going to be fun. Okay, so that doesn't apply just to this hypothetical scenario between you and me. It applies to everybody who plays Legions Imperialis, and it applies to everybody who plays a war game. Okay, you want to have meaningful decisions that matter on the table, um, and even if you don't necessarily win, if you feel like your decisions could have made the difference, and maybe it's just you got a bad dice roll, or your player or your opponent played better than you, then it's a lot easier to swallow a defeat. Okay, so let's go back to the counter argument too, because there's another thing that I want to bring up. So this argument, this real wars are not balanced, therefore war games do not need to be. This is what we know in rhetoric or categorical logic as an enthymeme, okay, which is a logical syllogism where one of the premises is omitted, and in this instance, it's the middle premise. Okay, so the The initial argument is that real wars are not balanced, okay, and we're going to talk about that in a minute too. But if we accept that, then there's a missing premise, and then the conclusion, which is that therefore war games should not be balanced. So this is a rhetorical device because it omits one of the premises, and the listener then fills in the gap mentally, right? So this is like in the horror movies when you don't really show the monster, but you allow your imagination to, the director allows the imagination to picture it for you. And oftentimes it's far more frightening and compelling than when you actually see the monster. Okay, and a similar device here with this enthymeme, right? So you omit the premise, you allow the audience to fill in the gaps, and this allows some rhetorical, logical looseness in the argument because you're encouraging this natural impulse of people to fill in the gaps. So what would the missing premise be? It would be something like all war games are or should be like real war or real battles. Okay, and so this is obviously clearly an incorrect premise. This is an illogical statement because the conditions that we fight in on the table only marginally approximate real combat, right? You can just look at the weapon ranges, the effects of, like we talked about, artillery in one of my previous videos. All of these things are represented in a war game generally, especially in the case of Games Workshop, because they want to sell models and they want you to have a reason to buy models. And whether or not that actually um, effectively represents or simulates the role of these weapons, vehicles, whatever, on the table or in real life, whatever real life might look like, is secondary to the fact that they want to promote you. They want to promote models that they want you to buy. Okay, and so like I mentioned, weapon ranges, right? So back in the day, a Space Marine with his bolter had a range, I think, of 24 inches, right? Whereas the movement of that same Space Marine was something like 8 inches, right? So the the proportion between movement value and weapon ranges is far greater in, or far smaller in real life than it is in Warhammer 40K. Okay, so just that has a huge effect on how the game plays. You know, you're also fighting on a limited amount of space. You know, you can't retreat past your baseline. So how do you do a defense in depth? How do you do a mobile defense? A double envelopment if you can't go beyond the flanks of the table. Like all of these things that are in real life do not apply, okay, in war games. Sorry, I'm getting bombarded by acorns. Um, so I hope that's clear. The other major thing is that war games focus almost entirely on killing the enemy. Now there are some games that do not, okay, but I probably should make a video about this on its own. But war games, for the most part, the primary way that you interact with your opponent is by killing the enemy. Okay, and yes, there are objectives on the table, um, but but in general, a military operation does not have the destruction of an enemy force as its primary objective. Killing the enemy is rarely the sole purpose of any military operation. Okay, and even if it is, you really have to look beyond. You have to look beyond the 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 act of killing for what it represents. Okay, and the objective behind it. So you know, somebody flies a bunch of planes into the Twin Towers, and we go kill that person. Okay, what the objective has nothing to do with the fact that we're trying to kill a person named Osama bin Laden, right? The objective is showing the world that if you fly a bunch of planes into buildings in the United States, that we will find you and we will kill you. No matter how long it takes, no matter where you are, you could be in a hole in the bottom of a sewer, but we will come after you and we will get you. Okay, that's the objective. The objective is not to kill some guy named Osama bin Laden. There's more beyond the killing. And to understand warfare, you need to understand that. Okay, destruction of an enemy army accomplishes nothing if the victory conditions that you're trying to achieve cannot be met. Okay, we destroyed the Iraqi army in Iraq. Did we achieve our objectives there? Okay. Similarly, and this is where we're going to get to talk about the balance in real war. Commanders have options to balance battles in real time, prior to and during an engagement. Okay, now that could include adjusting the balance of forces, bringing in reserves, changing the mission, changing the objective based on how the battle is going. Let's take Thermopylae as an example. The Greeks fought at Thermopylae, massively outnumbered, at least 10 to 1, right? Did they fight the Persians in an open field? No. They found a narrow, constricted space at a place called Thermopylae, and they fought them there. Okay, why did they do that? Well, because they wanted to balance the situation that they found themselves in. They used the terrain to equalize the engagement. And what did the Persians do? Well, they found a route around that narrow terrain, attacked the Greek flank, and defeated them. Okay? That kind of thing is very difficult to do in a war game. Now, of course, Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, but a strategic victory because it allowed the Greeks time to respond to the Persian invasion. How do you account for that in a war game? Now, you can do it abstractly, of course, but you would have to do something like, if you delay the Persians long enough, you get a certain number of victory points. And those victory points could balance out, the losses that you take in battle or something like that. Okay, so that's why real war is not as unbalanced as you think. It's not just about numbers. It's not even just about combat power. It's about politics, strategy, logistics, and so on. So let's go back to why it's important. So I said before that balance promotes meaningful decisions. Okay, that good war games, enjoyable war games, have meaningful decisions. And those meaningful decisions are promoted by a balanced situation. Okay, and that balance can come from, just as we've been talking about, it can come from the objectives, it can come from the terrain, it can come from the scenario, it can come from the forces. Okay, but that balance needs to be there in some way, in some capacity, in order for the game to be enjoyable. Okay, let's take Legions Imperialis as an example. Okay, it's not a perfectly balanced game. I think we can all agree on that. But let's look at what the game has become in just the last couple of weeks, right? We've had the release of the Liber Strategia. I haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, but I have seen an article, I think it was on Goonhammer, that showed all of the changes, or at least most of them, I hope. And these changes, for the most part, that I can see are very good because they promote those meaningful decisions. They promote balance. Where units were not useful before, they become useful. These changes are promoting diversity of choice in the army lists for the game and within the strategy of the game itself. And this makes it more expansive and more rewarding. And this is a good thing. If they had not done this, Legions Imperialis would be worse off. Okay, the game is better because of what they've done to balance it. Okay, and that's why war games need to be balanced. They don't have to be perfect. but they need to have something. All right, so I said in the title of this video that war games must be balanced, but the designers are always going to fail. And why is that? Well, let's take chess for an example. Okay, chess is about as perfectly balanced a game as you could imagine, right? You have two sides equally equipped on terrain that is uniform, but if you examine the game, and I'm not a great chess player, but if you examine the game, you understand that chess is not balanced because the player that goes first has an advantage. And it's not a significant advantage, but it is an advantage. So even something like chess is not balanced. So how could something like Legions Imperialis, Warhammer 40,000, Old World, Necromunda, whatever, be balanced when there are so many variables? Um, just thinking about playtesting something, you have different players, you have different terrain, you have different missions, you have different force compositions. Okay, how many games, how many players would you have to have in order to even come close to studying systematically all the effects of those different objectives or of those different um, variables? Okay, it'd be very difficult. All right, I think everybody can and should agree on that. The other thing that is also insurmountable is the fact that the people who play the game are going to be far better at playing the game than the designers. And this is something that you see in video games as well as miniatures games, right? Because the people, if you spend 1,000 hours designing the game, you're not going to be as good at playing the game as somebody who spends those same 1,000 hours playing the game. And that's just common sense, right? And this happens in video games, right, where people play the game for thousands of hours. They'll find flaws and bugs that the game designers would never have even dreamed of. Okay, so same thing applies to miniatures games. They will always find flaws and weaknesses to exploit. And lastly, and this is more philosophical, right, no human endeavor is perfect. I once heard a bricklayer say that if God didn't build it, it ain't no good. Okay, and whether you believe in God or not, that doesn't matter. The point of the statement, and I've said this several times in my life, and it's always seemed to confuse people, but the point of the phrase is that everything that is built by human hands is going to have some flaw. It's not going to be perfect. You lay a wall of brick, one brick is going to be out of place. There's going to be, it'll subside on one side because the foundation wasn't poured properly. Whatever it is, right? There's always going to be something. Same thing with war games. All right, and we can see evidence of this, of all of these things, of why war games will never be balanced, with the constant balance changes that are being made to 40K, right? They have a whole team whose job it is to balance the game, and yet they never seem to get it right. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that they don't improve it, but they're always making changes. People are always talking on the internet that I see, complaining about how this unit is unbalanced, this army is that, overbalanced. Um, and this happens for, I think, every game that I can think of, right? It just does. This is just how life is. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the game designers shouldn't try to balance their games. Right? Just because we can't reach the platonic ideal of a balanced war game doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? Same thing with anything in life. Just because you can't achieve perfection doesn't mean that the attempt is unworthy. Okay, so, and to kind of build off of that, right? The closer that you get to perfection, the closer that the game designers achieve balance, the better off you and the game will be, because it has become improved. And to go back to what I was saying before, right, that improvement is represented by the fact that the game is richer, it has more choices, and the players are more engaged because that balance provides a way for the players to express themselves, if you want to say that, to make those meaningful choices and then to see them represented on the table, and to see the effect of their choices. And if those choices are not meaningful, if they're not effectively represented, then your game is not good. So even a minimal balance gives a baseline for players to work from. And so even two 1,000 point armies in Legions Imperialis are not necessarily going to be balanced. You know, I think everybody knows that there are specific units, specific ways that you could play the game to manipulate the rules and the army building in order to get the most out of that 1,000 points. But the important part is that even with this minimal balance, it gives you a fixed reference point to adjust from. So if you say, well, 1,000 points of Titans is not going to be balanced against 1,000 points of tanks, you know, there's a common reference frame that you're working from. Okay, and that is, I think, just as important. Let's go back to chess for a minute. We talked about how chess was an imbalanced game because one player has to go first, giving them an advantage, setting the tempo. So that let's compare that to Legions Imperialis. Okay, so chess is an imbalanced game, but that really doesn't matter except for people who play at a very high level. Again, I'm not an expert in chess, but I understand a few things about it. If two amateurs play chess, it doesn't really matter that white gets to go first. Okay, and why is this the case? Well, because that amateur is going to sacrifice unintentionally his bishop on turn 30. Okay, and that's going to lose him the game. Does it really matter that he was able to go first? All this opening theory that you see really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for people who play the game at a lower level. Okay, and I think the same could be said for Legions Imperialis, right? If you play at a very high competitive level, you're very skilled, you understand the game very well, the imbalance becomes more important, and you have to exaggerate and work with it in order to compete at those levels. Whereas at the lower levels, where you're just kind of playing for fun, maybe you are new to the game, you don't really understand it, it doesn't really matter that the game has a little bit of an imbalance, as long as you're playing against somebody who is equivalent in your understanding of the game, its rules, and the army building setup and structure. Okay, so that is why games need to be balanced. That is why they will never be fully balanced, and why they should try anyway.